Welcome. I think we're gonna go ahead and start. I know there are folks out there searching for parking at the moment, but they'll join us when they can. My name is Heather Massera. I'm with the Center for Climate and Security. We're a think tank up in DC, and we focus on the effects of climate on the military, national security, the communities that surround military installations, and the nation as a whole. And we are very excited to be here partnering with local North Carolina partners, North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, and Sea Grant, and the Albemarle Pimlico estuary partners. So thank you all for coming today. Quick housekeeping notes: the restrooms are all the way at the back. In case of emergency, just take the stairs that are to your right that you came up through. And I'm going to dispense with a longer intro and go ahead and tell you about our true host for today, John Nicholson, who is the Chief Deputy Secretary for the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. He works closely with the Secretary Regan, overseeing a myriad of special projects, dealing especially with those which involve the military. John has a long career in public service. He was a colonel in the U.S. Marine Corps, where he served for almost 3 decades, deploying in support of Operation Joint Guardian in Kosovo and Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan, and retiring at the rank of colonel. This is apt preparation for dealing with extreme weather, natural disasters, environmental quality issues, flooding, and sea level rise. And apt preparation for service to 2 North Carolina governors as their military advisor. John also has a deep experience in advanced strategic planning, policy development, and has worked on projects dealing with energy and environmental conservation, all of which makes him the perfect moderator for today's discussion, which really brings together experts with an understanding of how the effects of sea level rise and extreme weather, to environmental security challenges and strategic risks faced by both the military and civilian communities in North Carolina are evolving. So without further ado, he's going to give a couple brief words, and then Rear Admiral Ann Phillips will speak briefly about the film, and then we will launch into the film.
Well, thank you, Heather. And good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming today. I hope you and your families and friends made it through the storm without too much damage. We did have a little debate on whether we would continue with this, but we figured, given what has transpired and where we are, that it was appropriate we continue the conversation. Our original intent was for Secretary Regan to be here to greet you, but as you might imagine, the Secretary's a little bit busy right now. He is out in the field, roaming around, seeing what's going on in the state. We have a lot of, I guess all of us do, have a lot of long days ahead of us as we start to clean up from Florence. I'd also like to start with thanking our partners from the Center for Climate and Security, the North Carolina Sea Grant, and the Albemarle Pamlico National Estuary Partnership. I just call them APNEP. They're in our same building. But thank you for coming together with us to make this event. If I could just get a quick hand for those folks. So we're here today to watch a very compelling movie on an area, or actually a region, whose strategic importance to our overall national security and military readiness is extremely vulnerable to sea level rise. Not to mention the associated impact on the local, state, and national economy. Efforts to build resiliency amongst these communities will require cooperation of policymakers, planners, scientists, scholars, military leaders, and most importantly, the local community. You'll hear more about this on the film. Additionally, we're very fortunate to have a tremendous cross-section of experienced leaders and scholars to share with us their thoughts on the topics of sea level rise and the impacts of climate on right? We're live streaming, right? So we're going to live stream the discussion today so it can be used as an opportunity to enhance public education and engagement about climate resilience. So I'll go in just a little bit here, not too long, about how I came to be in this bailiwick. As Heather mentioned, I did 28 years in the Marine Corps, and I came in the Marine Corps at about a time that all the services were taking a harder look at conservation and environmental impacts on the installations to the local communities, and how they did operations and training. I will tell you that, quite honestly, I was an artillery officer, so as a young artillery officer, it was scared into my brain if I screwed up and I killed a woodpecker. So that was just one example, but I was not gonna get a red-cockaded woodpecker or a fairy shrimp. But during that time, I was fortunate to serve with some of our preeminent leaders who heavily influenced me in how I chose to follow my career related to the environment, and in particular, the impact of climate on operations and the development of our strategy. One of those gentlemen, some of you may have heard of, was named Anthony Zinni, or is named Anthony Zinni. General Zinni at the time was the commander of the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force when I worked with him. He later went on to command U.S. Central Command, and I believe, I don't know if he's still a member of the Center for Climate and Security. But anyhow, General Zinni was a legend within the Marine Corps. I was on watch one night as a fires officer in our operations cell, and General Zinni came and sat down with myself and a couple other officers to talk about how we were doing our fire planning and what our priority targets were. And he rolled into a discussion about, well, what's your plans on that dam? What are you going to do if you shoot that dam? What are the second, third order effects? And to be serious, at that point in my career, I had not given that a lot of thought about second and third order. Then he pointed to an oil refinery and said, think about our experience in Kuwait with Iraq. What a mess that was. What are we going to do there? So as part of that discussion, it really got me thinking, and so happened I rolled out of that and went to Command and Staff College. And a lot of what General Zinni talked to us about that night was part of the curriculum. And I would say tempered me and my thought that as I went through on my education, that I paid attention to that. One of the big buzzwords in our two of our panelists, retired admirals, as a member of the Naval Service, we know that a significant portion of the world's population lives on the coastline. The number used to be 40%. It's probably gone up. I don't know. I'm a little dated. I'm seeing some nods. But as population density and economic activity in the coastal zone increases, the pressure on coastal ecosystems increase sea level rise as being problematic in so many ways. So the bottom line is that discussion with General Zinni, amongst others within my education, put me on a path to where this was of interest to me as I continued my career. I probably have partners that go the other way, but I think for a reason I ended up here. Never in my wildest dreams did I think I'd be working for Secretary Regan and the Department of Environmental Quality, an old artillery, jarhead working in DEQ. But I have to tell you, we have a great group of professionals that are passionate about the environment, passionate about the climate, and we also have some great, well-educated stakeholders that keep us honest and provide us, I guess, with supporting fires, reinforce us when we're in a situation we're in like right now with Florence. So it's very rewarding. So I think what we're here for today, at least from my perspective, I'll wrap up and say I'm looking forward to learning more about the challenges and solutions to security and how the Department of Environmental Quality can support efforts to build coastal and military resiliency from the film and from our panelists today. So with that concludes my comments. I would like to invite up Rear Admiral Ann Phillips from the Center for Climate and Security. Admiral Phillips is the former commander of Expeditionary Strike Group 2 and the director of surface warfare. Ma'am? Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming this afternoon. First of all, again, thank you to our sponsors, our partners in sticking with us this afternoon. We certainly would have understood if you had decided you had better things to do, and frankly, I imagine you do have better things to do, but it is a great opportunity to have this conversation, and in the context of all that's happening right now in the state of North Carolina and South Carolina, as someone from coastal Virginia who a week ago thought it was coming our way with a 10-foot storm surge, We understand what's happening. We haven't lived it, but we know it's coming our way sooner or later. So we wish you the best as you continue to recover, work through the crisis response and recover. So I'd like to talk briefly about the film Tidewater and the American Resilience Project, which is the organization who has created this film. In fact, they've created a series of films. The American Resilience Project, and Tidewater in particular, is a product of filmmaker and director Roger Sorkin. Roger is committed to environmental advocacy, and he's also committed to environmental advocacy in the context of national security. The American Resilience Project is a 501c3 organization dedicated to telling the stories of our greatest environmental and national security challenges, but instead of focusing on the negative aspects, inspiring action and investment around solutions that can build a model for American communities. Understand an attainable policy, figure out a cultural change that you would like to seek, and then produce films that highlight political, economic, and social opportunities. So in the context of doing that, Roger's first film you may have heard of, The Burden, which was debuted in 2015, and examined how Americans' dependence on fossil fuel posed serious and immediate national security threats and challenges, particularly to our forces on the ground in Iraq and Afghanistan. And also how the military was looking at clean and renewable energy as an option to free our forces, as then General Mattis is credited with saying, from the burden of the tether of fuel. Most recently, and I'm going to save Tidewater for the end, Roger has released this year, 2 weeks ago, 14 September in San Francisco, his latest film, Current Revolution, which is the first episode in a series of documentaries focused on the transformation of America's electrical grid, and I commend that to you if you are interested in that topic. It is a fascinating movie, and it is going to come at you from an angle I guarantee you won't expect. Tidewater, which we'll see today here in a few minutes. Tidewater debuted in 2017 at the DC Environmental Film Festival. It won a Greenfire Award at the San Francisco Environmental Film Festival and was an EarthX Film Selection also in 2017. The story of how Tidewater came to be is kind of interesting. At the time that Roger kind of came up with the idea to focus on Hampton Roads, the region was in the process of working through a pilot project looking at a whole of government and community process to deal with sea level rise impact on the region. It was convened by Old Dominion University. There were a number of committees and working groups involved. I was the chair of one of them as a volunteer. In my working group was an environmental lawyer who happened to be a friend of Roger's, and they talked about, he had been a part of the creation of The Burden, and they talked about what the next film should be, and he said, you know, you really ought to look at Hampton Roads. It's a critical national security impact. The region is not widely known or understood. People don't really understand the huge federal presence there and how valuable it is to the country, and also how vulnerable it is to sea level rise and climate impact. And so after doing some looking around, Roger came down, checked out the area, and decided that, yep, that's what he wanted to focus on, and so Tidewater was begun. Much like a lot of coastal North Carolina, we have a huge military presence. You'll see a lot of it. Nobody in the film is an actor. Most of the people you will hear interviewed are still very much engaged in the region trying to make progress. And Roger has the ability to take anyone and get them to tell him their story. And in Hampton Roads, everybody has a story about water. And so you're going to hear some of them. So I hope you enjoy the film and look forward to your questions afterwards. Thank you.
So just point of order as everybody's getting started. We're going to give each panelist about 10 minutes to talk through their background issues, concerns for the audience here. Then once we finish with the speakers, we'll go ahead and do some question and answers. So start queuing up your thoughts as the speakers are telling you a little bit about themselves and their thoughts on the subject. So with that, right now, I'll kind of run the list here. Immediately to my left is Rear Admiral David Titley, United States Navy retired. He's with the Center for Climate and Security and is the director of the Center for Solutions to Weather and Climate Risk at Penn State University and is the former oceanographer and navigator of the Navy. Welcome, Admiral. Sitting next to Admiral Titley is Rear Admiral Ann Phillips, United States Navy retired. She's also with the Center for Climate and Security, the former commander of Expeditionary Strike Group 2 and the director of surface warfare. Sitting next to Adam Phillips is Dr. Reed Corbett. He is the Dean of the Integrated Coastal Program, Director of Coastal Studies Institute, Professor, Department of Coastal Studies, East Carolina University. Next to Reed is Dr. Susan Cohen. She's the Coordinator, Defense Coastal Estuarine Research Program, Department of the Navy. Welcome, Dr. Cohen. Sitting next to Dr. Cohen is Holly White, Ms. Holly White, pardon me. She's the Principal Planner for the town of Nags Head. Welcome, Holly. And then down at the end is Dr. Gavin Smith, the Director of the Department of Homeland Security's Coastal Resilience Center of Excellence and Research Professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So with that, I will turn it down and turn it over to Admiral Titley. Thank you, sir.
No, I'm not texting, but turns out there's no clock in here, so my guess is my fellow panelists would be happy if I don't use the entire 60 minutes. So we'll try not to do that and get people out of here at least before Wednesday or before the next hurricane season or something like that. All right, this is the first time I've seen this movie. I guess in my business I get sort of movied out on all of these things, but I thought it was really, really interesting and actually quite well done. The Navy's known about this issue for a long time. I would say it's a long time now. I actually gave, I think, the first sea level rise and national security talk at Old Dominion University 9 years ago now, 8.5, 9 years ago. 9 years plus ago, the Navy formed the Task Force on Climate Change, which I was privileged to lead. And if we read the things that were written there, and we read the things that have been written by the Department of Defense and even the Naval Facilities Command, if we did what we said we have written down, we'd actually be in fairly good shape. So this is really a matter of execution there. One of the things, how many people, just a show of hands, have either worked with the military or maybe as a civilian in the Pentagon? I know there's a few. So if the Pentagon, if the military is nothing else, it is an intensely hierarchical organization. What does that mean? That sounds like some big word we'd use at Penn State. That means that if I'm interested and I'm the boss, you're fascinated. That's hierarchy. What struck me about this film, how many active duty 3 stars did you see? How many active duty 4 stars? How many active secretaries who are still there? Oh, I know, 0. Okay? So I can say all this stuff because I'm retired and the Navy doesn't pay me anything, so it's easy for me to say this. There's sort of lip service and there's doing sort of some things, actually more than you would expect from the White House tweets, I'll put it that way. But there is not, in my view, real momentum to do this or the other components of climate change. How many times did you hear the words climate change mentioned? Oh, I know. I don't think there are, were they?
That was done deliberately.
Yeah. So, you know, and it was deliberate. Why? Because we don't actually want to say it. Anyone remember Jack Welch, CEO of General Electric, that small little company? One of the things Welch said is, you know, the first thing you need to do to fix a problem is admit you have one and be able to identify it. The seas are not rising by magic in Norfolk. It's because, you know, all that coal, I mean, there was the irony moment for anybody who noticed it in the film. All that coal, when the CO2 is burned, it tends to warm the planet and melt the ice, this land ice. And when that happens, the waters raise, so they have some more issues at the port of Norfolk there. That was, to me, it sort of passed without irony in there. Reverend Lewis was really good, the moral obligation. I can tell you I've worked with Roman Catholics. They have something called Catholic Climate Covenant. They're working on this. The Jewish faith is working on this. The Muslims, I've been on Muslim radio talk shows on this. This is sometimes mentioned. Evangelicals are working on this issue. This is a matter, whether it's a moral perspective, whether it's a security perspective, an environmental perspective, you can take your perspective and really, really take a look at this. Admiral Phillips talked about some of the resilience towards the end of the film there. And I think something that, when I think about resilience, we should really think about is when you talk about those stressors, how much stress do you have? How long does it last, and how fast does it come at you? It's one thing, let's say, if you're preparing for 3 feet of sea level rise over 100 years, or does that 3 feet show up in 10 years? And does it not stop? Admiral Slates, I liked a lot of what he said, but it was interesting at the beginning of the film, he basically said, we're not going anywhere. It's too bad he's not here, because I would ask him, if we do not get our carbon dioxide emissions under control, anyone know if we do what we call business as usual, how much sea level rise we're probably locking in by the year 2100? It won't mean we have it at 2100, but we've locked it in. Anyone know? 30 feet, 30 feet, 10 meters if you prefer new money speak. That's a lot. My guess is you are going someplace at 30 meters, or at 30 feet. So we get to almost what I call a failure of imagination. We can't really imagine those kind of changes. Why? Because we've never, in human civilization, not as long as humans have been around, but in human civilization, we have not really experienced those kind of changes. And that's what we're locking into now. When I give my normal talks, I try to make stuff simple because I'm just a retiring and recovering weather forecaster, so it's got to be simple. So I try to boil down climate change into 3 words, and it's people, it's water, and it's change. And I think you saw all of those components in this film, even if we couldn't say the words climate change. It really is you and me, and our brothers and our sisters and our moms and our dads and our kids. It's about people in our community, people in our towns, people in our state, and people in this country. It really is about the water. It's too much, too little, wrong place, wrong time. It's salty where it used to be fresh, wet where it used to be dry, liquid where it used to be solid. Even actually the chemistry of the ocean itself is changing. And then finally, the thing that worries me mostly about climate change is honestly not the climate piece. I come from Pennsylvania. We don't see the sun for 6 months out of the year. We do not have ideal climate. It's the change piece, and it's how fast does it change and when does it stop changing? What I can tell you is that the climate will be changing, not just varying, but changing for all of your lives, your kids' lives, and most likely your grandkids' lives, at least. At least. Why? Because there's a lot of inertia in the system, and we've basically locked that in. And that's very, very different than what we think of in human civilization. We've had climate stability, and that's kind of one of the reasons we were actually able to build things like the Norfolk complex, the Tidewater complex, because although it was close to the water, and that gives us incredible advantages for security, for the economy, all the things you saw, a little bit of change is really, really disruptive. And it's not going to be a little bit of change. We are just at the harbinger, at the leading edge of the changes. So yes, we need to adapt, we need to be resilient, we need to do all of those things. I would argue in addition to that, we need to be able to have the intellectual and intestinal fortitude to actually identify why the hell is this changing. We know why it's changing. We've known, this is what I call cutting edge 19th century science. We've known for about 160 years why, what carbon dioxide does. And we need to simultaneously with getting ready not only in Norfolk and the Carolinas and in Florida and on the Gulf Coast. I did not go through Florence. I did go through Katrina, so I greatly sympathize with what you have just started a year-long journey on your recovery. But we need to be able to ultimately cap those emissions so that we get to the root cause, so that we're trying to adapt to 4, 5, 6, 7 feet and not the 30 feet, because that's going to be really, really hard to do. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there. I usually tell people that, this really isn't a political issue because the ice doesn't vote Republican or Democrat, it just melts. But somebody in the film actually kind of used my line there. So that's okay. And I will okay, I've got 50 seconds. One other thing. Whenever you have a chance to talk to your elected leaders at any level, I would just ask them, ma'am or sir, what are you doing to stabilize the climate? It's not a yes or no question, sort of like dating 101. Don't ask a yes or no question. You might get a decent answer, you might not, but it registers in that reptilian brain that one of their constituents, when they could have asked about anything, asked about what are you doing to stabilize the climate. And like several of the panelists, I do spend a fair amount of time in Washington. Members of Congress do care what their constituents think. Right now, a lot of them think most people don't care about this. And that allows other forces to move these votes. If we care, the Congress will care, and when the Congress cares, we will do things, and we will do amazing things. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Admiral Phillips.
Okay, so I have a clicker apparently. See if I can figure it out or not. Again, thank you everybody for your attention this afternoon. It's always a hard act to follow Dave Titley. I met him first while I was deputy in '86 in the Pentagon, and he was running Task Force Climate Change. And fortunately, he liked N86 because we were asked to do a study on the preparedness and readiness of surface forces to operate in the Arctic. We did that study. The answer was they were not. The answer continues to be they are not. And we'll just let the Navy figure that out over time. But at any rate, I learned early on that it's a good idea to listen and it's a good idea to do what he says. So after my 2-year adventure working on a pilot project in Hampton Roads, when nothing much was happening, I called Dave and said, what can I do now? And through a series of events, ended up on the advisory board for the Center for Climate and Security with him and a number of other exceptional colleagues. I'll just add a few things to the movie, I think, in the context of Hampton Roads and what's going on there, and then the larger Defense Department issues. First of all, the movie doesn't say climate change at all. Roger Sorkin did that deliberately with the intent of being able to show this movie more broadly to people for whom those two words are cause to get up and leave the room. They may choose to get up and leave the room anyway, but at least it was an attempt to try to get a broader audience interested in this issue as being a real issue that impacts people and national security and is not just a bunch of tree huggers. We'll see how that goes. I would say that in Hampton Roads, things are beginning to change over the past few years. The two slides there, the one to your left shows Langley in 2003. Langley's a very large Air Force base. Combat Air Command is there, along with a number of other real-world, real-time operation sort of stateside support entities. Langley is extremely low. It floods all the time. They have prepared themselves, this is from Isabel in 2003, but they have prepared themselves by working with NASA, with whom they share a fence line, to develop software that helps them predict, which is now being folded into a larger Hampton Roads project called Adapt Virginia Portal, a large data collection and analysis effort being run by the Virginia Institute of Marine Science, but with a specific impact on NASA Langley. They can predict what's coming, and so they plan accordingly with how they're going to prevent water from getting into their buildings. They've cleared out all their basements. They had a few. They've cleared out all their partially submerged first floors. They're elevating as much as they can of their utilities. They've turned things into, basically they grout the ground floor or tile the ground floor or subterranean floors as much as possible so that if water does get in there, they just hose it out and they're good to go. They have reduced the cost per flooding event substantially from hundreds of millions of dollars down to a few $100,000 or less for substantial events over the time that they've been using this software, which is roughly 10 years or so, maybe a little bit longer. So they have a real interest because they have a real need. The other picture is last weekend, Larchmont, Surrey Crescent, a obviously routine flooding place. That was before the storm, lunar flooding. And it can be worse than that on any given occasion. So the two areas you saw in the movie, Hampton Boulevard, well, this is the water from that floods Hampton Boulevard comes from this area. This is a matter of routine. The marsh grass, people's front yards here are starting to grow marsh plants because it's wet all the time, and that's what comes up. The grass dies, and up comes Spartina patens. So the area that we drove through on Llewellyn Avenue, that's all marsh now. We've got alterniflora growing in there, for those of you who are interested in marsh plants. That's something that has to have its feet wet all the time. So that particular road, average two-lane road, not big thoroughfare in the city, but not a major thoroughfare in the city. It's wet more often than it's not. And the only time this summer that it wasn't wet on a pretty routine basis was a dry spell we had in the end of July and early August. So we're dealing with this stuff all the time. The military takes this seriously. They do not see it as an imagined or politicized threat. 19 and counting senior DoD officials have acknowledged that climate change is happening, that it's human-caused, and that it is a challenge to our national security. But in the current environment, there are grave concerns of getting ahead of the administration. So everyone is cautious, and the military will focus on resilience, they will focus on readiness, but they are very reluctant to go much farther into discussing or acknowledging climate change as a matter of routine. And in fact, resilience and readiness are key issues for the military anyway, and so that is a way to move forward. And we've also seen things in Congress move things forward too, and I'll talk about that right at the end. Let's see if I can get this to go the right direction. Okay. Usually Dave shows flooding slides or data slides, and so today he will allow me just one. This is data from Dr. Larry Atkinson, and I need to update it with him. But the point is, nuisance flooding, which is just over 1/2 meter, is accelerating and increasing. More hours of duration, more depth of nuisance flooding, more instances of nuisance flooding, and the variety of causes is continuing to expand. And what you can see from the bottom is the black line is the nuisance flooding line, and the blue is the data for high tide, and they're about to cross each other almost nearly every high tide cycle within maybe 10 or 15 years. So we're going to be seeing the kind of flooding you saw on the previous slide in the neighborhood that I showed very soon, nearly every high tide cycle. We had much higher water because of a lunar cycle before the storm, which you saw, although when the governor made a decision on the evening of Monday evening as the storm was approaching to evacuate Zone A in the state of Virginia, we were predicted to get a 10-foot storm surge in Hampton Roads. So he made the right decision by evacuating Zone A. Everybody didn't leave, but a whole lot more people thought about it than would have otherwise. So to make the point, if you didn't get it already, that there's a lot of federal presence in Hampton Roads, this is a slide from the Hampton Roads Municipal and Federal Facilities Alliance, which is an organization supported by cities and the business community, really to ensure the health and vigor of interest in our federal facilities in the region. 29 separate federal entities represented, hundreds of facilities, as you can see. 2/3 of what's there is military, 3/4 of that is Navy. Now, Navy, obviously has to be near the water, but we have some very unique things here. The only place we build nuclear aircraft carriers, any aircraft carriers, is in Hampton Roads. One of only 2 submarine construction facilities is in Hampton Roads. The only place we refuel carriers is in Hampton Roads. We also do that for submarines. Largest naval base, arguably the largest naval base in the world, and an awful lot of other unique and expensive facilities. So while it is not true that we're not going anywhere, DoD will make a decision based on cost-benefit over time. It is true that there are an awful lot of facilities here that would be great expense to move or to reposition even locally. So that figures into the mix. But because 65% of the people in this region live in one city and work in another, and most people don't live on the bases that work on the bases, you can't do this one base at a time. The whole region has to be involved here. One more kind of good example. This is from Hampton, City of Hampton's Resilience Plan, Volume 1, which they have just put out this year. They, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 2015, we had a Dutch Dialogues in Hampton Roads. Looked at areas in the city of Norfolk. Chesterfield Heights was one of them, which you saw in the movie, and areas in the city of Hampton. And when that particular week-long effort ended, Hampton took what they had learned and basically said, this is our plan, this is what we're going forward with. So that has manifested itself in Resilient Hampton Phase 1. And so you can see the slide on your right shows elevation. Dark green is 4 to 7 feet, lighter is 0 to 3 feet. Most of the 17 cities and municipalities are in the green category. So when it comes to thinking about where you're going to go, rolling easements and all those kinds of things, we don't really have anywhere to go. We're going to roll right into ourselves because it's all low and it's all flat. Another interesting nuance to this region, up here you can see a little bit more on where the federal facilities are, although some are missing. The 13-foot inundation is actually light blue. It's mislabeled here. 8 feet is dark blue, and then the federal facilities are yellow, and the industrial are purple. You can see where the major highways are as well, although most of them are elevated. So what makes Hampton Roads interesting from a governance challenge is that in Virginia, we have two things that make us a little bit unique. We are very strict interpreters of the Dillon Rule, which means that cities and municipalities derive their power expressly and individually from the state government, and they can only do what they are authorized to do by the state government. Unlike home rule, where you can do whatever you feel that you need to do unless you're prohibited from doing it, Dillon Rule is the opposite. What that means is that they are not allowed to collaborate as a group in a formal sense without the express authorization of the General Assembly. The other thing we have is something called an independent city. Some of these independent cities have been independent, like Norfolk, for over 400 years, but there was a rash of land grabbing in the 60s, cities annexing other areas, and it didn't only happen in Hampton Roads, to get more space so they could enlarge their constituency and their tax base. Independent cities are chartered by the state government. There are 41 independent cities in the United States, 38 of them are in the state of Virginia, 10 are in Hampton Roads. So these cities have their own court systems, they have their own government systems. Everything about them is unique and independent. So we basically have stovepipes of cities all operating throughout the region. And in the context of how some of the cities became independent, there was a lot of friction. And so they are still fighting with each other and competing with each other. This does not lend itself to regional collaboration. They are all planning individually and independently for what they need to do with this challenge. Some are ahead, some are behind, some are in denial, some are thinking as far forward as they think they should reasonably. Norfolk is one of the Rockefeller 100 resilient cities, so they and Hampton are kind of in the lead. Virginia Beach saw the light after Matthew. Matthew wasn't even a tropical storm when it got to us, but it flooded new and in different places in Virginia Beach, including some rather expensive communities. And suddenly, the government in the city of Virginia Beach was a lot more interested in what was happening there. But everybody's doing things differently. Not that it's not good work, it's excellent work. The challenge is, how are we going to collaborate? How are we going to move forward together? There is some good news. The Planning District Commission is now talking this summer. They voted unanimously to have a special subcommittee of Planning District Commission members, city council members, elected officials, city managers, to specifically look at sea level rise in the region. This is something we've been trying to get done for 2+ years. That actually happened. And this you'll recognize from the movie, but that's also Llewellyn Avenue, the street I was driving down, just a little farther down. And they also have begun to talk with their board about ways that they can collaborate as a region and what the value in collaborating as a region will be. So this is big progress. It's taken a while to get to this point. It's a small step in some ways, but it's a big step in others, because 2 years ago we wouldn't even have had that conversation. So I think in closing, the national security implications for coastal communities like Wilmington, like coastal North Carolina, Jacksonville, like Hampton Roads are substantial. We are on all critical infrastructure ports. Wilmington is, Hampton Roads is. Wilmington is a critical military embark point. So there's a lot to lose here in coastal North Carolina, as there is in coastal Virginia. And so we're close to each other. You know, the water that comes from Pamlico Sound into Virginia comes from North Carolina. So there are good reasons for us to share and to collaborate and to try to move forward together, sorting out what these challenges are. Realizing that everybody has their own political system and their own political processes. I've got that. But there's unprecedented risk here, but we also know, as Dr. Chitley has pointed out, what's happening, and we know what to do about it. So the challenge now is how can we collaborate to mitigate these impacts, and how can we move forward? You know, our children's future really depends on it. So thank you for your time. Next slide.
Thank you, ma'am. All right, now we have Dr. Reed Corbett. All yours.
Appreciate it.
I got a pen back.
And so I thought I'd just start with introducing myself. I am from Eastern North Carolina. I think, enduringly referred to as a child as an officer's brat. I grew up on Cherry Point, a Marine Corps base, surrounded by water. I moved away for a while, got a few degrees, and I've been back for the last 20 years studying this state, studying Eastern North Carolina, and now living on the Outer Banks, living around and surrounded by water. And North Carolina is challenged, just like the film showed for Hampton Roads. It's challenged in that we are surrounded by water, not just on the Atlantic side, but we have the second largest estuarine system in the U.S. as well. When we think about Eastern North Carolina, we need to think about some of those challenges that we face moving forward in the face of something like sea level rise. But I think it's important that we don't just isolate one of these problems like sea level rise, because these problems, they compound one another. And so what I've done is tried to summarize some of the challenges that we do face, some of the vulnerability that Eastern North Carolina faces today, and in fact, what we're dealing with right now. And so thinking about Eastern North Carolina and our vulnerability, we have to think about not just sea level rise and the rate of rise today, let alone what the rate might be in 10, 20, 50 years down the road, but the fact that we do have a very low-lying coast. And our coast is different depending on if you're in Northeast North Carolina versus around Wilmington. And you can see that by the change in colors, right? Those colors are reflecting the topography, the elevation. And sort of the rate at which those colors change tell you something about slope, right? So up in the Northeast, the slope is very low, and so a slight change in sea level will flood a lot more area compared to those that are challenged right now with a lot of water to our south. And so that low-lying area is going to create a problem when we have issues associated with sea level rise. But again, as these water rise slowly, and they've been rising for the last several hundred years, as they rise, we're going to have other things impact them, like storms. Florence, for instance. And so that's why we can't think of sea level rise in a vacuum. We have to consider how that compounds with all of these other things that are ongoing. Because we will be challenged not just to deal with the nuisance flooding, but the storm surge and the extra half foot associated with sea level rise on top of that storm surge, because the oceans are warming, leading to some of that sea level rise, which is creating these mega storms. I don't know if I should take it that far, but these storms that are generating much, much more rain today than they have in the past. I mean, it's interesting, although sea level rise shouldn't be political, we are in North Carolina, right? And we've faced sort of the political challenge associated with just stating sea level rise in 2010 through 2012. And that was, I think, a real challenging time to be a scientist in North Carolina. And it's interesting, at least I find it interesting, that that is raising its head again today in the aftermath of Florence. And that's frustrating to me because I think, and I don't think I'm the only one that would think this, I do think we have made significant strides in getting science out there and informing the constituents throughout North Carolina as well as our leaders. And we're much better off today than we were in 2010 and 2012. And we shouldn't dwell on that dark past when science and politics really didn't see eye to eye. And I do think that we are opening people's eyes moving forward and the challenges that we face, and that the science is true, and that we are here as good stewards of that data. And that, as a scientist, that's why I'm here. I'm not here to create policy. That report wasn't out there to create policy. It was to inform. And that's the best way to educate the communities out there. They're dealing with it. We need to inform them. We need to provide them with the data. And that's what we want to do moving forward. And we do face challenges, and how do we actually deal with those? And I would say we are actually dealing with those in different ways. As we get into higher sea levels, as we deal with more storm surge, as we deal with nuisance flooding, we have to think about how we might adapt moving forward. And there's three typical ways, and there's many others, but three typical ways we can think about adapting, at least on the coast. And those are protecting the coast, whether it's hard structures or soft structures, adapting to the coast, or adapting to the change, and then retreat. And nobody likes to hear retreat. I live on the coast. I don't like to hear retreat. But we have to think about these different ways that we can adapt to our setting. As was already said, and I think said in the film, we aren't going to be able to protect everything always. And we need to consider that moving forward. And when you look at these three things, protect, adapt, accommodation, and retreat, we're doing all of those today, and I sort of provide examples of that. On the beachfront, we are nourishing our beaches as a way of protecting the shore by adding additional resource, sand, that can then slow the encroachment of the ocean, building dunes to protect everything behind those dunes as a first order of defense. Accommodate, I've given the example of a jug handle, what we're referring to as the jug handle, right? It's a new bridge being built around a very weak point of the barrier island, going around the backside of the barrier, so we don't have to hold the road in that location any longer. It's a way of accommodating changes that are taking place. It's not making everybody happy, but it's allowing for that flow of traffic continuously. And the retreat, and the best example of that, there are many homes that have retreated into other lots, but a great example of that is the lighthouse, right, which was done in the late 80s, early 90s. And so we have to think about that moving forward. And the last thing I'll say is we are dealing with a historic storm today. And although, the aftermath will be, months, if not a year to come in dealing with it. And I don't mean to be insensitive, but this is also an opportunity for us to think about the implications of these storms, to see where the weak points are, where we're most vulnerable today to storms like these, and to think about policies that can be put in place today that make us more resilient during the next storm. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Corbett. Dr. Cullen?
Just throw something at me. Thank you, sir. Well, I still work for the Navy, so I'm not going to say anything because I want to be paid. Let it all flow to you, sir. No, I'm just kidding. I have a confession. I live on Topsail Island, and I work on coastal resiliency. And it's crazy, right? And I actually just sold my house, and it's under contract, and I was talking to my realtor, and she said, Susan, I did a closing on a house that is oceanfront on the Friday of the storm. And I said, you've got to be kidding. She said, those people walked into that office and said, I want that house. I don't care the storm's coming. Let's close this thing. So it's crazy, right? I mean, it's crazy. We make these crazy decisions, but we live in paradise. We don't want to leave. And then we have storms like this, and we're all going to cash our federal insurance checks. And thank you all very much for supporting that fund. So even today, knowing these risks, knowing this huge oceanfront house was about to get clobbered, these folks did not care. They wanted that house, and they wanted to live at the beach. So we have a social problem as well. My experience working with DoD is on the installation level. For the last 15 years or so, I have worked on dozens of research projects. I primarily only do research. and I've worked on dozens of installations across the country. But the biggest project I've ever worked on, and the most intensely I've ever worked on it, was the Defense Coastal Estuarine Research Program, or DCERP, at Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune. And this was a Department of Defense funded study. It is unprecedented in size and scope, 10 years, dozens of researchers. A few of them are here today that were involved in some way and shape and form in the project. It was a multi-million-dollar effort, and it was extraordinary. And our main goal at Camp Lejeune was to study ecosystems. How do they function? How do they respond to stressors and drivers? What are those stressors and drivers? Are there thresholds we can identify? Are there indicators we can identify? So we take all that information, and then we study it under the context of climate change. And then we take all of that, and we always have to think of it within the context of the military mission of training and readiness. All of the work we do regarding ecosystem services and ecosystem resilience and the research we did ultimately goes to support the warfighter. That is the primary objective of the Department of Defense. And all of my experience over the years working on installations and all of the incredible science that we have done over the last 10 to 15 years really supports my belief that not only is sound ecosystem management that supports resiliency compatible with the DoD mission, it's complementary to it. The Department of Defense requires large pieces of land of varying ecosystem types to support varied training opportunities. And if you can't support those ecosystems and their resilience to stressors over time, you can't support training. So there is a strong link between good ecosystem management and the Department of Defense. And it's not everywhere, and we don't see everybody employing it. And there's a lot of talk and not a whole lot of action, but we do start to see some movement on that. So what did we do in DCERP, if I can get this to go? Well, when you have a 150,000 acre installation that is the largest Marine Corps installation on the East Coast and is home to the most premier amphibious training environment in probably the world, you break it down into grabbable sizes of ecosystems. So I'm pretty loud, so tell me if you can't hear me. So we studied these 4 ecosystems on the left, and we did research, we did monitoring, we did measuring, and we did experiments. How does a parameter react to a certain condition or a certain forcing? Then what if we change it? How do we find that threshold where maybe there's going to be a regime change in a marsh? Maybe we're going to go from Juncus to Spartina because we have increases in salinity or increases in water level. So we take all of that and we start making predictions. We feed all this data into models. They are not perfect. My favorite model in the world will tell you models are horrible, but they're better than nothing. They provide us information about maybe a trajectory or the range of conditions we can expect to see, and they certainly help guide us in our decision making. So that was essentially how we managed to grab our hands around this huge installation and study all these ecosystem processes within the context of climate change, and then always remembering the boundaries and fluxes between these systems. They share water, they share nutrients, they share sediment. These ecosystems are all connected. So that was our major task, and we have tons of information, and we love sharing it with everybody. So hopefully we'll be able to get you some of that contact and those links to website. So as I was trying to think, well, how do I tell people about 10 years of intensive research with a team of, 50 plus lead scientists and postdocs and PhD students and master's students and technicians who really do all the work, let's be honest. And I can't. So these are some really big things that I've been thinking about, and I know members of the research team have been thinking about, and they seem simple, but when you start to sort of dive into it, it gets complicated, and everyone has sort of spoken about this a little bit, and I think we're going to hear a little bit more about it. So context matters. Everybody's context is not the same. DoD's context is not the same as municipalities' context. We may have some big goals in common, but we don't share a context, and that is a real challenge. Scale matters. If we have a local, small-scale issue at Camp Lejeune, say a splash point. A splash point is where an amphibious assault vehicle will traverse from land to water to land. Maybe it's eroding, maybe the marshes are starting to degrade around it, and we're not being able to use it like we need to use it. That's a local problem, and we're gonna keep that in our context, and we're gonna handle that locally. But when we start talking about the New River Estuary, that Camp Lejeune completely surrounds 80% of its shoreline, that is not a local problem for Camp Lejeune. That is an Onslow County problem. And we're gonna have to work with the municipalities,
the cities, the counties, and we've heard some of the difficulties with some of these cities in Norfolk area all working together. Norfolk is one of those cities, I should have said in the Hampton Roads area, to be more correct. So scale and connectivity are going to inform who your partners are, and your partners all are not going to have the same goals. This is going to be great fun. We're going to figure this out. And when I see a room of people like this that are invested and from all different kinds of organizations, NGOs, government agencies, it was hard to see that woman hand her mother a life jacket, right? But when we have a room like this and everybody's gathered together, it kind of lifts me back up and fills me with a little bit of optimism. Generalize with caution, but don't reinvent the wheel. We know, for example, marshes will adapt to climate change by retreating, migrating towards the uplands. That's a lesson for everybody. But what your marsh is doing in your area may be a little bit different. But you can take those lessons and apply it, but generalize with caution is always sort of our mandate. Even with uncertainty, managing for resiliency is never a bad idea. Making no decision is a decision. You've decided to do nothing. And I've never heard of a case where managing for good ecosystem resilience backfired on anybody. So always try to move forward, even in the face of uncertainty. And then last, I thought this last one was a little bit more DoD-centric, but in hindsight, it is not. DoD is challenged with constantly emerging and evolving challenges. World scenarios change, training needs change. If there's a short-term training need that needs to be met by an installation, it's going to be met. We will get it done if a warfighter needs it to get done. However, if you can pause for a minute and put a short-term action into a long-term context, maybe you can set yourself up a little bit better for the future. We're going to do the action regardless, but maybe we can do it a little bit smarter. And one that I didn't put up there that I probably should have, which sort of makes me think about DoD and responses to climate change a little bit, is penny wise, pound foolish. You know, we can try to skate by now, but in the back end, it's going to grab us. So sometimes it takes time to sort of slow down and think about these larger contexts and these larger consequences. So that's sort of the on the ground. We communicate all this information, all this science to the installations that we work on. We try to communicate it to the broader public. And we just try to educate the managers on DoD installations who do extraordinary jobs and are sometimes ill-equipped and not really funded to go past their short-term management vision. So often they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. So I will stop there, and I look forward to a very lively discussion later. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Cohen. Now we're going to get a new perspective.
Yeah.
So, Ms. Holly White, Town of Nags Head.
Good afternoon. It's so great to be with you all. There are so many similarities, I think, between the Tidewater film and what I think we're doing in Nags Head, this on a much different scale and a much different context, as Dr. Cohen mentioned. But there's a lot of similarities there and a lot of the same symptoms that we're seeing in the Outer Banks, as well as what we're working to resolve. So were you guys able to pull up the slides? Okay. We're going to keep rolling then. So Nags Head, in the context, is much, much smaller than the Hampton Roads areas. We're about 2,900 year-round residents. That increases to 40,000 during the summer months. We have around 11 miles of ocean shoreline and 17 miles of estuarine shoreline. And our economy is rooted in the tourism industry, and obviously there's a direct link there to the environment. One of the key contexts, I think, for moving forward and some of the symptoms that we're experiencing is that 85% of our town is on septic systems. So as you can see in the picture, this is from 1980. So this is, Dr. Corbett talked about vulnerability. And Nags Head is not new. Vulnerability is not new to Nags Head and learning how to adapt. We've always been exposed to hurricanes and coastal erosion. I think since the mid-'80s, around 120 homes have been lost to coastal erosion. But in order to live in this kind of environment, the community has been forced to learn to adapt, not only to survive, but to thrive. This is a photo from Hurricane Matthew. And what we're seeing now, most people think of sea level rise, I think, as water over land. Hurricane Matthew, we received an intense amount of rainfall in a short amount of time, coupled with a high groundwater table, and that resulted in localized flooding. So this isn't storm surge related, this is just rainfall flooding, similar to what's being seen in the Hampton Roads area. And in recognition of these vulnerabilities, the town committed, and this is our elected officials committed and asked to initiate 2 long-range planning processes. One is a comprehensive plan. This plan was adopted in 2017. And the VCAPS, Vulnerability Consequences Adaptation Planning Scenarios project, and this was done in partnership with North Carolina Sea Grant. Also, the Coastal Studies Institute was a partner in that as well. So both of these processes were heavily community involved. There were citizen committees involved in those, as well as opportunities for general community input. The comprehensive plan helped to establish a vision for our community, develop policies that could be used by staff on a day-to-day basis to guide growth and development, and then actions for follow-through to help us achieve that vision. The VCAPS process was conducted simultaneously to that and served as a means to have input from the community. This input through the VCAPS process and through the comprehensive plan process were extremely important for our implementation phases later on, as we're implementing as we speak now with certain projects. Having that community involvement as we go and to have the community buy-in is so important to the implementation phase and making sure that we can actually achieve these projects and that they represent the community needs and desires. So this VCAPS process utilized the diagramming that you see on the screen. It allowed the participants to identify the hazard, to look at what the outcome of that potential hazard might be and the consequence if the town chose to do nothing. The interesting part about this process was it allowed the citizens to be a part of the process, but it educated them throughout participating in this, and they were able to arrive at their own decision that, hey, if we do nothing about this groundwater situation, this may be a big problem because our town is served by 85% septic systems. So we may have a water quality issue in the end. This was not something that the town forced down their throat. It was something they were able to realize through this process. So there were 140 actions developed through this process. Those were both public and private. And I think it's important to note that there were private actions identified during the process because I think that there's a responsibility by citizens to participate and help. In order to be sustainable long-term and to fund implementation, it can't only be local government developing these solutions and implementing these solutions, but there has to be private responsibility as well. These actions were pared down into kind of 4 broad areas for our project: ocean shoreline management, estuarine shoreline management, stormwater management, and water management, and that included ground and surface water. So from that, there were 7 key actions. There was a citizen committee that was developed. They voted on these actions, and these are the 7 main key actions that arose out of that. 4 of these are in implementation currently. The number 1, these are actually ranked in priority by the committee's voting. So the number 1 priority was to maintain and expand the Septic Health Initiative. The Septic Health Initiative was started in 2000, and it was in response to a concern about water quality. And so the town is still committed and concerned about water quality, and the point that we know that groundwater is going to continue to rise. That will continue to be a concern, but we want to be proactive in dealing with water quality issues. We are currently updating our decentralized wastewater management plan, have retained a consultant to do that. Additionally, we are working with NCC Grant to help develop a suite of sea level rise scenarios and probabilities that can be carried forward into future long-range planning efforts. Additionally, the last two items that are in implementation are to develop a long-term shoreline management plan. We're working with a consultant to do that, as well as a long-range plan for stormwater. So why does all of this planning matter? And how will it help us to adapt and be more resilient? So the comprehensive plan for the town sets the vision, and the policies that are in that plan help to guide growth, and that's a guide for staff and elected officials. The actions then become a work plan and an easy way to incorporate actions into the budget. So additional study may be required. We may need more education. There may be items that are capital improvements through this, or maybe we need changes to our actual regulations, which is what we're undergoing currently. But ultimately, these policies and actions change the way we build and respond in the built environment, and ultimately making us more resilient. In closing, our mayor, Ben Cahoon, equates the town's response to sea level rise as a marathon, maybe an ultramarathon. This isn't a sprint. And he encourages communities to start doing something now, because we've learned that efforts that involve community involvement and long-term investment will take time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ms. White. And all right, Dr. Smith,
Okay.
good to bring us home.
All right. I'll be watching. I know I'm the last person, so I'll be watching you to see if you need, just give me a sign of some sort, and I'm usually pretty good. I'm pretty well trained. So thank you for having me. I'm going to try to do a couple of things. I'm going to speak off of one slide. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go individual, local, global, and back to the state of North Carolina. I'm going to try to do that in about 7 minutes. We'll see. So I am definitely a waterman. I grew up on the coast. I grew up in a little coastal town called Shore Acres in Texas. And for those of you that are in the hazards community, a colleague on the panel is from Waveland, Mississippi. So when you hear waves, shore, topsoil island, and so forth, you know your town's going to get racked. So my hometown was destroyed by Hurricane Ike. And in fact, the home I grew up in was destroyed. And the reason I bring that up is not to actually draw too much attention to it, but rather to draw attention to one of the elements in the theme of the book that we did in 2014 that distilled 265 recommendations from a global assessment of the degree to which communities around the world were taking what we already know about hazards risk management, in essence, hazard mitigation or risk reduction, disaster recovery, and applying that to climate change adaptation. And I guess one of the lessons I wanted to mention, it's really heartening to see Norfolk and the work that they're doing in the Hampton Roads area. When we wrote this book, we didn't have really a good case to look at in the US. And so we were looking all over the world, and what we asked writers to do is to look at whether it's the Indian Ocean tsunami, whether it was wildfires in Australia, whether it was flooding in London, and so forth. We asked the authors to look at a major disaster that struck their state or nation or region and apply lessons that could be used in climate change adaptation. So, for example, issues of, we had engineers looking at flooding in London, and one of the topics and key themes I think we all need to recognize, and I think those of us on the panel know this, but this notion of stationarity, the idea of looking to the past to develop models that will help inform our actions in the future, that's an outmoded way of thinking. Yet that's where almost all of our models, that's the way they've been developed in the past. And so that's a fundamental shift that we've got to think about. So I'm going to talk a bit about that in the context of planning. But bringing it back to the local context, there's a moral imperative, and it was really heartening to see this in the movie. Is there was I think it was the minister that talked about the moral imperative, and that is fundamentally important. I think sometimes we lose sight of that. And the reason I bring up the coast is that we are inherently tied to the coast. You know, I'm a coastal person. There's a deep sense of place and place attachment to the coast. There's a reason why people live there. And so I think it's important for all of us. I mean, we're scientists and we're researchers and so forth, but people live on the coast for a reason. There is a definite draw. There's no doubt about it. I think about it every day. I live in Raleigh now, But also, just to bring us back to kind of this moral imperative, we had the money, we sold our house, a person bought it, I moved my mother to Raleigh, but there are a lot of fishers, shrimpers, crabbers, those have water-dependent uses, they're not leaving. They don't have the options. We had money to move and sell the house. Strange aside to that story is the house was sold, the person rebuilt it back before they adopted more stringent codes, had 10 feet of water in it, but it's still about on a 1.5 foot crawl space, perpetuating the next disaster. And it's just a little microcosm of the issue. I think sometimes we think so big, we don't think about the human dimension. So there's definitely a moral imperative. And these, the dimensions that are written behind me are, again, the distillation of recommendations across all of those case studies that we did globally. There's also this notion of governance, and that was good to hear, too, that governance was brought up repeatedly. But what I thought was interesting is when they showed the one slide of government, or governance, I should say, they showed a bunch of federal agencies. And there's no doubt that the federal government has a fundamental role to play because there's massive investments, whether it's in infrastructure, whether it's in monies post-disaster, whether it's in terms of national policy. All of those resources are brought to bear at state and local levels. But I would argue there's all sorts of other groups. There's social justice groups, there's quasi-governmental groups, regional planning organizations that frankly are going to be struggling in the Hampton Roads area because that's a huge challenge because of all the issues that was really eloquently brought up earlier. So there's this governance issue that's broader than just federal agencies, all of those partners. But there's also the private sector, which is alluded to in some fashion, but not completely, which brings me back to the kind of the Texas example. And our house was destroyed after Hurricane Ike, and actually I was on a committee, a panel, that was talking about they're going to build the Ike Dike. They're going to build this massive dike to protect, in essence, the Houston Ship Channel. The community is perhaps less important, in my opinion. And so I was asking one of the leaders of a major petrochemical industry that will remain nameless, and they never even saw the irony, kind of the coal story. They never saw the irony of one of the largest petrochemical facilities in the world and its relationship to climate change. And so anyway, they were talking about the Ike Dike, and they were pushing for it, and they had the members of their legislature at this panel and committee, and they were saying how they were going to help the petrochemical industry. And I raised my hand and I said, well, how much are you going to pay to build the Ike Dike? And the executives looking like, what are you talking about? The federal government's going to pay for that. And I thought, I mean, do we not see the irony here? I mean, it was just, and they didn't even understand. I was trying to explain, okay, you burn fossil fuels, we use fossil fuels, the climate's changing, you're playing a role in this, do you think you ought to have a stake in it? And they literally looked at me kind of dumbfounded, and I just gave up. I just said, I can't, you know, I walked away, tried to remain calm, but it was just, to me, that goes back to this notion of governance. I mean, I think we really need to play or spend more time perhaps talking about the role of the private sector and the role that they may play in this. The notion of planning, that was great to hear Holly's comments too about local planning. But one of the things that we know, and we have known for some time, and one of the chapters in the book deals with scenario planning. We've been talking about scenario planning, and different people call it different things. This basic idea that we've been doing planning for a long time in the land use planning community that is kind of predict and plan, or if you will, predict and plan based on that knowledge you've got. Well, in an era of climate change, we've got to plan for deep uncertainty. And this is something that we're still trying to get understood. We're starting to teach it in planning programs and so forth. But in a very simple sense, one of the ways to get at that is looking at some of the things that Holly and others talked about, these hazard mitigation and risk reduction measures, taking into account the risks we face today, but also thinking into the future and coming up with a series of scenarios and coming up with some contingent strategies, which got me thinking a little bit about the discussion about the state legislature in North Carolina. I was on that committee. I think, Reed, maybe we were both on it from different angles. Well, I was tasked with developing the adaptation strategy for the state based on 3 scenarios. And the legislature told us, assume one scenario. That's no change. And so as a planner, I really wasn't sure where to go with that, but nevertheless, I'll just leave that as it perhaps just maybe for discussion a little bit later on. Some of the other elements, this capacity imperative, I didn't hear that much talked about it in the film. I thought that was a bit of perhaps an oversight, and that this is one of the hard things that goes to the social element that was described also by the panel, is how do you build enduring capacity? How do you draw from deeply held indigenous knowledge, people that have lived there for centuries, decades? I mean, that the families have relied on the water as a resource. How do we draw on that deep knowledge? Sometimes as outside experts, sometimes we don't fully recognize that. We don't draw on it. That's our mistake. We should do better. So all of these elements, again, are distilled. I think they very much reflect the elements of the film with some changes. And I just will, perhaps, just a few other comments is to think about. There is a lot that we already know, both in terms of land use planning, hazard risk reduction, and disaster recovery. That was a theme of this book, and drawing on those lessons. They were showing some elevated houses. We call that hazard mitigation, risk reduction. They talk about retreat. We call that risk reduction, hazard mitigation as it relates to land use planning. These are tools and techniques that local governments have in their toolkit, and they've had it for a long, long time, and we need to do a better job of that. On the other hand, the book also talked a bit about disaster recovery. And sometimes we lose sight of that. And I'll give a few examples in North Carolina. In a former life, was assistant director in North Carolina Division of Emergency Management. And we acquired, give or take, about 5,000 homes in the floodplains of eastern North Carolina after Hurricanes Fran and Floyd. And that's a good thing. We gave money to individuals so that they could move to higher ground. In fact, we even put state money on top of the buyout so that poor people could get a decent house outside the floodplain. Of those 5,000 homes, how many do you think were on barrier islands? Any guess?
None.
Zero. Yeah, that was an easy answer. Yeah, that's right. So there were no willing sellers, which goes to the issue that was also brought up is this deep resistance to change. We were the same way growing up on Galveston Bay. We were resistant to change. We were perhaps not thinking fully about the risk, but then again, we had the wherewithal, the means to move away. I'm not saying that that's what everybody's going to do, but we had the resources to do it, and a lot of people just don't have that. Perhaps just in closing, I guess what I would say, and it made me think of this too, the political issue, is I was returning from a trip. We were advising the Coastal Protection Restoration Authority in Louisiana, and it was a strange confluence of factors. And so we were sitting down, we were leaving Louisiana, and Senator Cruz sat down next to myself and a colleague from New York City. We were just coming back to advise them on how to spend the billions of dollars they're using in oil revenues to adapt to a changing climate. And we were leaving, and then Senator Cruz literally sat next and said, "Hey boys, what are you doing? Why are you here at the airport?" And we both just kind of looked at each other and we said, "Well, we're here at a conference with Louisiana because they've recognized that climate change is happening. We've got to do something about it." And he just looked, he thought, what the hell have I done? Just sat next to these two guys. And so I said that, and then my colleague from New York City said, "Yes, and it's happening, and you need to get off, off your backside and get back to DC and make things happen." And he just kind of stepped back, and that was kind of the end of the conversation. But in closing, I guess really what I wanted to say is that there is inherent, unfortunately, we're one of the few nations in the world that has deeply politicized this topic. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to try to figure out a mechanism by which we draw on what we already know about hazard risk reduction, about disaster recovery, and feed that into our larger efforts to adapt to a changing climate. Thanks.
Well, that was terrific, and it blew through some of the questions that I was going to ask. A lot of you already addressed them, but I think I'd like to start with the question, Admiral Titley, it wasn't lost on me either that there were no senior leaders that were currently serving standing there talking about this. And I think, Dr. Cohen, you may see it with the work you've done down at Camp Lejeune. Unless it's pushed from the top down onto the installations, nothing's going to happen. I may be overstating. I don't think there's going to be any homegrown up from an installation to go out to look at an issue like this. So I guess my question for the overall panel is how to get the community engagement. The big word in North Carolina that scares the military community is always BRAC, in whatever form that might be. But that's a significant driver. What can communities do to help with mitigation resilience to the local installation? How's that for a wide open first toss at you all? And I'm not oriented at anybody, so first come, first serve.
this work? Yes, it is. All right, great, excellent. Somebody's smarter than I am. Probably everybody's smarter than I am. So I'm living this dream in Hampton Roads, and there are a number of challenges here. I will attempt to not have a whole panel just be about this. First of all, one of the challenges with within the different services, and I'll speak from a Navy perspective, is they all value infrastructure differently. In the Navy, we do not value or fund infrastructure. We don't care. I didn't care as a ship captain. As long as I got to the pier and I had internet and hopefully power, I was good to go. If I didn't have power, as long as I had internet, I was good to go because I could run my own generators. So we just don't really think about it. The Air Force values it a lot more. They project power around the world from their bases here. The Army's kind of in the middle. Marine Corps, I can't answer that question, and there are people here who can, so I'll let them answer it. But I've heard a colleague of mine quote a former boss of theirs in the engineering field in the Navy as saying, we're not going to put another dollar into that pier. That pier, when the last ship pulls away from the last pier, the pier's going to fall in. And that's all the money we need to put into that pier. We don't care. So we reap what we sow. It's the last place we put money. We like stuff, we don't like infrastructure, and we're going to have to deal with that. We're going to have to change our perspective in the future. We also change bosses all the time. So every 2 years, maybe in Hampton Roads, we have a new regional commander. That person is not only the commander of the Hampton Roads or Commander Navy Region Mid-Atlantic has a huge territory. Hampton Roads is where they are based, and that's the middle of it, more or less. But 2 commanders ago, that person was very interested in sea level rise and impacts. That person got joint land use studies going, approved through the Office of Economic Adjustment for Hampton Roads, 2 of them looking at sea level rise as the encroaching entity. They are currently in progress. That person left and went to Europe. New person comes in, excellent officer, fine gentleman, never been to Hampton Roads before, can't spell sea level rise, doesn't stop anything that's going on, but it's just not their #1 priority. So things kind of truck along. But when tough decisions have to be made, and it's not that #1 priority, it's going to fall by the wayside. So now we have yet another person, and I don't know them at all, and we'll see how they are. But a lot of it comes down to who's in charge, as Dr. Titley has said. So if they care, if they're interested, then their subordinates think it's fascinating. If they're not interested, they're going to move on to other things. And in their defense, there are real-time, near-term problems to be solved. Here's my funny story for Hampton Roads from Florence. The piers flood badly in Norfolk. It's the only place in the Navy where you can't leave your car on a pier. Well, it's going to change over time, but even before everybody talked about sea level rise, everybody knew you couldn't leave your car on the pier in Norfolk. So they're sending all the ships Monday afternoon, it's in the paper, ships are sortying. Of course they are, it's the right thing to do. Don't leave your cars on the base. Where are they supposed to go? Where are they supposed to put them? If that was a part of the policy or the direction, it didn't get translated to the general public.
And we don't issue self-driving cars.
Right, so if you're me, single sailor an awful lot of your career, that's a big, fiasco. Where do I put my car? Who's going to take my car? Do I put it in the parking garage? Am I going to have to pay? Can a friend take it? Can I leave it here? Can I leave it there? Do I take it over here? So what are all these people supposed to do? 80,000 people have to, in some way, shape, or form, figure out what to do with a car. Now, a lot of them left it at their house. That's fine. But in Hampton Roads, that can be dangerous, too. One thing you saw the sailors talking about, I thought it was a puddle, and then what do you know, it's up to my windshield. Well, that can happen at night. There's plenty of places in Hampton Roads where you could come out in the morning and find water over the floorboards of your car parked in an apartment complex that does not look wet to you just because of rain overnight or high tides. So, this is an ongoing and evolving strategy, and the story I tell in the movie about having to wait up your street at night, that was my aide who came from Japan and not California, and was shocked to find she had to park her car across Hampton Boulevard and wade into her community through 18 inches of water every time there was a thunderstorm. That's not gotten better. That's still going on. So back to the Navy question, the leadership changes all the time, and the best thing to do for the community is to continue to establish processes such that when that new leader shows up, everything doesn't fall apart. Things are in right, which is, we tried to accomplish this with the pilot project. Document what needs to take place and how you will inform and engage the military community, and keep those actions underway so that as the new commander comes in, they fold into an action that's already in progress. That's the way to do it, and it's very hard to do, because in Norfolk, we're trying yet again to get some of those things up and running, to establish relationships that have been lost over time just because one commander leaves, personalities change, and poof, no more interaction.
So Admiral Tetley, you had a comment?
Yeah, just very, very quickly. Yes to everything that Admiral Phillips said. But I think your question was, how can communities kind of, get this to work? And yeah, there are all these challenges as is being articulated. One of the things communities can do, and especially with bases, huge economic engines, so usually most local congressmen and women are very interested in maintaining those bases, have the communities articulate what needs to be done for resilience to their members. And it's, of course, more helpful if they're on armed services committees or the committees that write the checks, what we call the appropriators. But that can be really, really useful, because the Congress can be a huge headwind or a huge following wind. And what we've seen sort of mostly below the radar, it's not in the tweet of the moment, is in the last 2 to 3 years, Congress very quietly has become, I would argue, much more constructive on this issue, at least for climate as a security issue. And there is, if I understand it correctly, some language in the current version of the defense bill. It is not being signed yet, it hasn't gone to the president, but it will actually allow the Department of Defense to spend money beyond the fence line to help, like Hampton Boulevard and things like that. So how do other communities, one, make sure that's useful, and when Congress tells, and consistently over time tells the Navy or tells the Department of Defense, look, we are interested in this, so you guys better do it, that can really be helpful, and they have the power of the checkbook. So I would say, yeah, going to your base commander, sure, you can go to your base commander, and you should, and try to do those things, but there are the challenges of working it that way. Work it with the guys who have the checkbook and write the laws. That it can be frustrating, it can be massively frustrating, but I think that's turning, and that's something that can be exploited.
We have seen some of that in Hampton Roads. Congressman Taylor, 2nd District, Virginia, proposed for the Defense Authorization Act that the Defense Access Roads Authority be expanded to make improvements to critical roads outside the base that are directly impacting access to the base, using Hampton Boulevard as an example. That is in the Defense Authorization Act. So many of these things have been approved through the Defense Authorization Act, but some of them require appropriations as well, or increased appropriation to actually be functional. And so that remains to be seen if that will take place.
But it's really helpful when you can say it's the law.
Mm-hmm. But then you still have to work out how you are going to come, okay, yes, now we can use this program for this. How do we do that? How do we figure out what to do? What are the costs? What is the timeline? It's still complex.
Dr. Corbett?
I can't really speak to installations, but at a community level, you see something similar in that whether a town, a community is talking about climate change, is talking about sea level, is dependent on its commissioners, is dependent on the mayor and their interest for that community. And I think events like what we've seen over the last week do bring it to light. I think it's important that these sorts of discussions happen more often, that the community is hearing about climate, is hearing about sea level rise, and it's not something foreign. They are getting good data, and that there is trust in the data that they're getting, and I think that's been a challenge in the past. And so moving forward, the more that we can have these sorts of conversation, it's not going to be foreign for a town to get together and have a very forward conversation about what are we going to do with groundwater and sea level. And that's critical moving forward, especially when we have our leaders of our local communities changing every 2 years or so.
Yep, and so just 2 quick points. One is what's nice to see in the face of the lack of a national policy on climate change adaptation. We're down at the bottom of the world in terms of one of the few that don't have one. But what's happening organically is that there are regional compacts forming. There are groups, whether it's in Norfolk, whether it's in Southeast Florida, whether it's in San Francisco Bay Area. These are happening organically, which in some ways might be more powerful. Time will tell, because there really are more grassroots. That's one issue. The other is going back to some of my earlier comments is there's a lot that we already know about this and how organizations form and how they are effective or why they're not based on extensive literature from the hazards community. It's an issue salience that political scientists have been studying for decades, but we don't seem to be conveying those lessons or actually sharing those lessons with others. And I think that's an important oversight.
Oh, no, please, Holly.
I was going to add as well that to what Reed said, that I think that the level of trust, I know in the case of Nags Head, we were working with Dr. Jess Whitehead, and we were talking about the science and trying to make sure that our decision-making is rooted in science. And to have a good understanding of that as we, not only conduct the citizen-based process, but that they're informed as they make their decision about the science. And I think having someone from the Coastal Studies Institute to be there, they're familiar with maybe their friends, maybe they see, Dr. Corbett out at dinner, whatever be the case, that the Outer Banks is a small community. But there's a level of trust that exists there that they know him, they know his work. And so I think it made it easier to have that discussion. I do have to say that this project was not something that staff recommended, it was a board directed. And we have since changed boards, so our new mayor and board are carrying out the implementation of that. And I think the thing that has made that move more easily has been that it's been incorporated into an adopted plan. So it became part of an adopted plan. It's integrated into our policies, and it can become an actionable item that staff carries forward no matter if the leadership changes.
So getting back a little bit to the rotation of military leadership that the Rear Admiral's brought up, I've seen an erosion over the last 10 years of the counterpart civilian leadership that used to be a part of military rule, that high-level ranking officers were not rolled into high-level civilian jobs immediately, and if they were, it was at great penalty. That is no longer the case on installations. So we're not seeing the long-term institutional history and experience and management on an installation that I think we used to see. And I think there's been a real erosion of that civilian contribution in very high decision-making places on installations. So it just sort of compounds that 2-year turnover of leadership on top of it all. And that's just been my experience with the Marine Corps. I'm not sure what goes on in the other services regarding that. And I don't know why there's been that sort of shift in power play. I can make some guesses, but we can leave that for probably another day. And there are programs, at least within the Marine Corps, again, I do not know about the other services, where there are programs where lands are bought up surrounding installations to prevent from encroachment issues. And they can multiple use those lands. It's not just a encroachment against noise or fire or things blowing up. It's encroachment against climate change. And if smart people are leading those efforts, they can accomplish multiple tasks at once. And there's millions of dollars being put into these programs. And then there are interesting efforts going on around the world. And again, I hate to keep focusing on the Marine Corps, but that's really my biggest experiences. When they move Marines from Okinawa to Guam, they are looking at freshwater supply, and they are looking at saltwater intrusion. And I hate to say it, but it seems like it has to be right in their face, rather than some of these slow, creeping changes, maybe to say forest or marsh resilience. So it is sort of one-offs, and it doesn't seem to be comprehensive. But if you look hard enough, you can sort of find some of these efforts going on. So it's it's pretty complicated.
No, well, thanks for that answer. And on that, I'm going to turn and look out. Is there anyone in the audience who has a question? Yes, sir. I don't have a microphone for you, so.
That's right. I can speak up. I'm Doug Nichols. I'm retired executive with the electric utility industry for 35 Loved the nostalgic piece of seeing, I've watched my family on the piers, we left on destroyers, so enjoyed the film. But all of this is talking about adaptation, and I would like to address a question to the panel about prevention. This is a little bit like a expert panel of pulmonologists talking about cancer, lung cancer, and talking about how we treat the disease, but no one's asking people to smoke less. So how do we do that? There is, by the way, a growing bipartisan movement in the Congress on this. The U.S. House now has a Climate Solutions Caucus consisting of 86 members, evenly split between Republicans and Democrats. And they're there to talk about climate change and legislation that might do something about that. Carbon fee and dividend is a proposal we've proposed, but I would like, if anyone on the panel would like to address prevention, I'd appreciate that.
So for the feed, just so you can pick it up, the question to the panel is, what can we do about prevention?
Okay, I'll start I did kind of address this in my remarks, that if we keep going business as usual, you don't get to adaptation by itself will not fix anything. I'm far from the first person to say this. John Holdren and people before him, said there's three combinations of what we're going to do. We're going to adapt because we've already baked in changes that are going to happen. We need to reduce and change our energy mix, and there are a number of policy options that will get us to non-carbon-based energy. And I say that very broadly. It's not just wind and solar. It can be non-carbon-based energy. So that's mitigation, if you want to use that term. And the third component is suffering. And we're already doing that and paying. I wrote an article on the carbon tax that we never voted on, but we're paying today, and we're going to continue that. So we're going to, those are the three levers. The one that is painted bright red that nobody wants to touch is called geoengineering. That's another topic for another discussion. That's the one that says don't really go here, but we might. But basically, we have three levers. So this is really the political issue, right? And this is, while we all like to think when we work on an issue that our issue is different and special and it's never been seen before, human history is littered with examples of where we knew the technical solution or the pragmatic solution, and it took us decades to get there. The medical profession knew how to fix scurvy about 150 years before we actually fixed it. We knew asbestos in the very early 20th century was bad, but we didn't ban it till 1973. It took about 60 years to ban, or basically start reducing cigarette smoking, and people still smoke. Can I say that in North Carolina? So, yeah, so it's like, oh, don't go there. This is like, now you're hitting home here. We can talk climate change, but don't talk about tobacco. So, why? Because these things all have different constituencies. There's tradition, there's all kinds of inertia. So are we going to get on and reduce our CO2 today or tomorrow? Probably not. But whatever we can do is going to be very, very useful. And if that's a carbon tax, I'm sorry, I know I'm supposed to say fee and dividend for the CCL guys. But if it's some sort of carbon tax, that could be, if it's cap and trade, if it's other, there are a lot of ways to do this. And that is the debate we should be having, not is climate change happening or why is it happening, but really the debate should be, so what is the policy and how fast can we, in fact, in a meaningful way, reduce our emissions? Because that, as I mentioned in my first remarks, means that places like the shores of Carolina may only have to adapt to, let's say, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 feet of sea level rise, not 20 to 30. It's a big difference. So yes, we're still going to have to adapt to big changes relative to stability, but we have in our hands the ability to still ward off some very, very serious consequences, but we have to take action. That's the policy part.
And I don't really have much to add. That was a great answer. But to reiterate, the train has left the station, right? And so we are going to have impacts. Yes, we should be having both conversations about adaptation how to slow the process. But at this point, this is going to be something that we're dealing with regardless of what we do today, tomorrow, or 5 or 10 years down the road.
Okay, do we have another question? Yes, sir, please.
So I'm a climate scientist here at NC State. I'm asked a social science question. So I tell my students climate change is a force multiplier for inequality in society between genders, between races, and certainly socioeconomic. So my question is, what are national security implications of an increasingly unequal society, one of the drivers of which is climate change?
Okay, so for the feed, what are the national security implications for an unequal society? For military readiness and an unequal society? Of an unequal society.
I mean, I'm happy to, but here, have some other people talk.
Well, actually, I'm not from the military, but I will. I am a social scientist, so I'll go back to what I was discussing earlier, which is there's a lot that we know about social vulnerability and how it's disproportionately impacting communities, individuals, certain groups, obviously much more than others, and even within our own system. So, there are lessons here as well, I would argue. We do a really bad job post-disaster in terms of providing aid to the marginalized. The list goes on and on. The lack of available programs for renters, programs that imply loans that many poor people can't get. The list goes on and on and on. And there's a lot that we know. And so I'm going to give you a soft answer, frankly, is that I'm criticizing our own policies. And I guess if nothing else, what I'm hoping to do is that we can draw from those lessons. Well, actually, frankly, we need to change the disaster policies that we have in place. But there are important lessons, I think, relative to adaptation. And if you're going in this direction, if we continue to, if in fact climate change in the U.S. and a democracy is powerful enough to cause a split within society that would lead to some type of open revolt. I don't know if that's the direction you're going, but that maybe we could talk about that right after this panel.
So I'll jump in for a second and say there's clearly a national security implication globally, and it's national because we're going to feel it at home. And I think the first place we're going to see it is not just marginalized communities, marginalized countries. I mean, there's going to be wars over water. There already are wars over water. And when the United States has interests that are threatened in those instances, we will probably participate if we have to. And those will have implications back at home, right? So we may not have a national security implication directly here, but it sure will be indirect when sailors ship off or we send some of our war fighters to go on an international mission where natural resources are the causes of more wars. I mean, that's sort of a big, out in the future, but I think that's not too far-fetched.
So as a social experiment, we were going, I was fascinated by what was happening in Cape Town, South Africa, because they were going there. Brilliant. They were going there. We were going to see the haves and the have-nots. Who could afford to bring in water? Who could afford to put in their own wells? When they finally got a little rain and were able to slow down their cascading spiral into, well, we don't know what it was going to be, but I mean, we were going to have the Army out protecting water distribution lines because people were angry that some of their neighbors were able to afford their own stuff and others were not. So, I mean, that's the closest near-term social challenge that we were about to lay this all bare in an ugly way in a first world country, in one of the 100 resilient cities from the Rockefeller Foundation, who knew they needed to diversify their water source and yet hadn't done it. They had plans, but they just hadn't gotten there. So fortunately, we didn't, it didn't descend into that, but boy, it was close. It was close.
Great example.
So when I think about national security and climate change, again, I'm just a simple weather forecaster, so I can only do things in threes. Changes to the operating environment, and the Arctic is kind of the poster child for that, but there are many others. So, well, this is not an Arctic panel. That's going to be Wednesday in Washington. risks to infrastructure and training areas, and that's mostly what we've talked about. That's what the film is about. The final one is, for those of us of a certain age, we remember the BASF commercials, we don't make things, we make things better. Well, climate change is the opposite to that. We don't make things, we make things worse, and sometimes catastrophically so. So many people know the Syria story. It's a very complex, it's like doing an accident investigation for an aircraft that goes down. It's rarely like the pilot was stupid and the plane crashed. It usually doesn't work that way. It's usually about 10 or 15 things, all of which were fairly unlikely. They all lined up and people had a really bad day. Syria is kind of like that. It goes back to the 1970s with Assad, and there's a whole story. We don't have time to tell it. But part of it was we had a drought, the likes of which really had not been seen. And attribution science, which is a rapidly growing area, as I'm sure you know, in climate, has very high confidence that that drought was more intense and more severe than would have otherwise been had we not been changing the climate. There was also a really, really bad drought in this country, in California, a few years later. We did not have ISIS, at least to my knowledge, wandering around the streets of San Francisco and Los Angeles. And I think, you really see the difference between, okay, so climate makes bad things worse, but again, how much is it pushing against? In Syria and in Assad, you had a guy who was frankly whooping up on his population to begin with. You certainly had other things like 1 million Iraqi refugees in the cities back a decade ago. But you had somebody who was not taking care of people, fomenting tensions and ethnic divisions, and then climate just is like throwing gasoline onto the fire. California, lots of mistakes are made, but at the end of the day, we did not have California disintegrate into social anarchy. We used resources, and we had some, even the rich people in Beverly Hills, right, they were eventually kind of shamed into cutting back some of their waters. There was some perception of, equality in sharing these sacrifices. The farmers were told to stop growing such water-intensive crops like almonds and rice to some degree, all those sorts of things. And we were able to, through governance and some degree of resilience, and frankly being rich, we were able to make sure that we did not descend into anarchy. But from a physical standpoint, those droughts actually have a lot of commonalities between what Syria saw and what we saw. The difference was how we had used the other resources and then our governance response. And the more I look at this, the more I think that while, yes, I do climate science, I do meteorology, but it really comes down to the social aspect, the response and the governance and the societal aspect of it, more so perhaps than the physical stressor of climate.
All right, thank you. Heather, do we have time for one more, or one more out there? Okay, let me see if I can recap for the feed here real quick. Thank you, Linda. Thank you very much. What kind of things will drive us to adaptation and potentially to migration? Is that broad enough? Okay.
Yeah, I was just, as you were reading through that list, and I don't have a pen with me, but I could literally see each one of those, there's a business model out there. I mean, I'm trying to think this through from a business perspective. I would predict in time there will be businesses that line up, whether they're developers, whether they're people that can take the science, and the reinsurance industry is already doing this. I think there will be businesses that are going to start to form and line up and emerge that are going to grapple with each of those issues. It's a very broad answer, but I think that, and I had a conversation with a colleague in coastal Louisiana as we were touring the area with the Coastal Protection Restoration Authority. They're talking about spending about $50 billion in oil revenues to adapt. And people were coming up and saying, I've got this great business model. I'm a person that elevates houses, or I do this, anyway, it kind of had my head spinning, but I do think that in time, there will be businesses that are going to be forming around all the things that you just mentioned.
I think you answered your question there, and that, I mean, the economics can really drive this, right? And up to this point, we've always sort of circled back around and taken that out of the equation. But as we move forward, thinking of the flood insurance and how we can deal with growth and development in the future, I mean, the economics are going to drive whether we're going to continue to develop or if we're going to look for different ways to do it along the coast.
Sorry, Linda, I got nothing for you. The fishermen of Sneed's Ferry are never leaving Sneed's Ferry.
Right, well, so that's an interesting part of it, that people look at Tangier Island, you know, you're gonna have to, the last person off Tangier Island's gonna leave tracks in the sand. And they should, that what would you expect them to do? They're born and raised there, have been for generations. But yet there's this this paradox of it's going away. We can't stop it.
That's right.
All the fill and all the bulkheads in the world aren't gonna save Tangier Island forever. They'll slow it down, but it's gonna go. And I mean, now those are fighting words in some places in Virginia, so. But the challenge, we talk about this a lot at Hampton Roads, is who's thinking beyond 50 years? Who's thinking beyond stormwater problems and living shorelines, which will last beyond 50 years, but there'll be more living shoreline than there will living homes. And who's, in the context of these independent cities, this structural governance challenge that Virginia's created for itself, you know, what happens when there's nowhere else to go in Virginia Beach or Norfolk? Where are those people gonna go, and when are we gonna realize we're at the tipping point where we aren't economically viable anymore, we don't have enough people to pay taxes to maintain utilities, we can't maintain them anyway, they're submerged, the groundwater, the salt water, the whatever. No one wants to think that far in advance. And so this, you know, the low country of South Carolina, I've had people say to me there, I know I should leave, but I don't wanna go alone. I live here, my friends are here. What if we all went together? I'd be interested in going if we could all go together somewhere. And they know, they don't mean over the bridge, over the causeway. They mean Greenville, they mean Columbia, they mean somewhere, you know, because there's not a lot of choices until you get pretty far up into the state that aren't going to be impacted sooner or later. But how do you start that process? Give people a range of choices that they can understand. I mean, there's, okay, you can turn over your land to a conservation easement, and you can actually, the Middle Peninsula, Virginia has done a tremendous program that gives people choices to turn their property into a conservation easement through the public access to shoreline program. Really inventive, working well, low populated area, high income by and large, not exclusively. So things that work there won't work as well in other places. But people don't even have a range of choices right now. They have there's no process they can step through that you can point to and say, here's what you can do if you want to move, and here's how you keep some viability for a city. Do we do joint incorporated cities? Do we match WISE Virginia with Norfolk and have them become one city but in two different locations? And so people are moving out of one area that people are going to have to leave, I know it's pie in the sky, into an area where they need people, where they need industry, where they need development. I mean, that's an extreme example, but we're going to have to start thinking through some of this, because places where we are now on the coast in this country will not be around forever. And in the context of a city that has an average elevation of 5 feet above sea level, that's not Norfolk, but it's other cities in Hampton Roads, what are their choices? Can you harden them? To a point, but even that won't last forever. If we're going to get to 30 feet, got to build a 31-foot wall, and then what happens?
Yeah, could I tackle that just real quick? So there are tens of thousands of homes and communities that have been relocated using post-disaster mitigation money, but the problem is most of them are riverine. And so that's place attachment to the coast. But my point is there's important lessons there. A lot of people are staying in the floodplains, and the buyouts are checkerboarded as opposed to contiguous parcels. You've got to find the resending area and so forth. But there are some communities like in Hillsborough County, Florida, within their disaster recovery plan, they have resettlement zones that they have identified in their plans that are adopted by council, which is shocking to me that they did this, but it hasn't been tested yet. So there's little bits and pieces that it's out there, and I think there are lessons to be drawn, but the idea of large-scale resettlement from the ocean is going to be a big issue. And that has actually happened on the Galveston Bay area on Bolivar Peninsula. Don't have time to talk about it in great depth, but there have been some cases. So there are bits and pieces and some lessons, but it's not done in a comprehensive way. And
I've been researching this for something else, and I can only find
yeah, maybe we can talk.
I mean, this is really interesting. I mean, you know, and history is never obvious when you look forward. It'll be really obvious when we look back 150 years from now. It's also interesting you talk about where do you go. I've actually had discussions with the Pennsylvania state legislature. There is a climate caucus there, believe it or not, and I've talked about how, and also to the insurers of Pennsylvania, how Pennsylvania should position itself as a climate refuge. And who else? Maybe it's upstate here in the Carolinas, could be a similar type thing. We're going to warm up, but we're not going to be stinking hot. We're not going to have the sea level rise. And because we're far enough north, and I define far enough north as north of 40 north, I know we're going to have rain because it dries out in the subtropics, and if anything, we'll get moisture, basically, in the north of 40 north. But it's all those other things. You got to have the infrastructure and education and you know, make people want to do that. But I think all those people who moved for the Sun Belt out of the Rust Belt in the 60s and 70s and 80s, I could see in the latter part of the 21st century a reverse migration going on. Now that just makes people think that I really am crazy, but I can see that happening in this. The other thing you bring up, which I think is really interesting, is what is or will be these series of events that really get people off top dead center. And I went through Katrina, and everybody said Katrina was going to do it, and everybody said Sandy was going to do it, and now I'm sure everybody's going to say Florence. Oh, it was the HIM storms. It was, you know, Harvey, Irma, Maria, and now it's going to be Florence. It's sort of this episodic versus chronic, because even in really bad episodic things, the sun comes out, the water goes back, and everyone says, you know, it's nice here, it's not so bad. And we go on as before. In my public talks, I usually talk about if I could do one thing financially, I would short South Florida real estate, because eventually that's going to go. And they're all on limestone, so they can build the biggest levee in the world. It's not going to matter. But before they physically go underwater, long before, at some point, it's going to be a market psychology, and the market will turn, and the smart money says, I need to get out now. That hasn't happened yet, but at some point it will, and there will be a rush for the exits, and then it's not going to be the really big guys. It's going to be normal people who are going to get really hurt because they're going to find their life savings. And if you think we've got a social justice issue now, wait till you have something that makes the Great Recession look like child's play, when you have, again, millions and millions of people who all of a sudden found out their life savings is worthless. And I think in Norfolk, you're already starting to see this. You're seeing this in other parts. People cannot sell their house or can't sell it for anything worthwhile. So at what scale does that happen? Where do they go? And what will, if anything, the government do to, you know, will we say, well, geez, you shouldn't have lived there? Or will we compensate them and give them a start so they can, you know, it's going to be really tough, but they can at least get a new start on life. So this is, you know, when I talk about people, water, and change, this is the change part. And this is the piece that really, if anything, keeps me up at night. It's the change piece. Thanks.
Well, thank you. I feel like I'm leaving with more questions than answers, but that's great because we have a reception next door during which you guys can all chat with one another and attempt to mingle and perhaps come up with some of these answers. Since I'm the last one standing between you and the snacks, I have the pleasure of saying thank you to all of our wonderful speakers, our partners, the staff of EPNET, Sea Grant, DEQ, especially John Nicholson. Thank you so much for your wonderful moderation of the discussion. And Lisa Tolley, who is back there with her foot raised because she broke her ankle last night, and she's still here. And if that's not resilience, I don't know what is. So I think a round of applause for Lisa. Let's see. Thank you as well to Sarah for mastering the PowerPoint slides, the AV staff and the webcast staff for sharing this with the rest of the world, and the folks here at NC State, and Madge with catering and her whole team that put together the nice spread that we have next door. And I abbreviated my remarks earlier for the sake of time, but I just wanted to mention how thrilled and proud I am as a native North Carolinian that we're having these forward-looking discussions in the Tar Heel State. And I have to give a quick thank you to my dad, who is here. This is the first event he's ever been able to come to in 2 decades of me being in the national security world. And part of that's because this is in North Carolina, but part of that is because he was a city manager and a public works director, and this is the first time our worlds have collided like this. So I am thrilled to see his people in the audience along with my people. So thanks, Dad. And as the panelists touched on, the other C's, not just climate change, but collaboration and coordination at all levels of government between the military and communities and faith groups and across public and private sector, the environmental world, organizations, academics, civil society, and elected leaders. That coordination and collaboration will continue to push towards resilience. I think that's really what the focus was here today and what we're all interested in, and the preparation for what is to come. So, we're at a point where we have unprecedented foresight. We understand this. We're getting the science. It's 100-year-old science, but we get it now. And now we have a responsibility to prepare. So I just want to point you quickly to a literature table in case you're interested in reports on sea level rise and Coast Watch from Sea Grant. And as they say in the military and disaster operations, you don't want to be exchanging cards on the battlefield or the floodplain, so go meet and greet one another next door. Thanks.
Where can we find this, Heather, for folks that want to?
Oh, the live stream on the DQ website, I believe, has a link. The Center for Climate and Security website, we have a link to the web stream. It will be housed forever, hopefully, on our YouTube website, so you can go watch it again or send it to all of your friends into the years to come. So, thank you.